welcome. My name is Petra and this is my first ever knitting podcast. So welcome, thanks for watching this episode. I do hope you subscribe and I hope that you enjoy the content so that we can have conversations moving forward. I've been a knitter for a while, so I started knitting probably about 12, 13 years ago. And then I had a bit of a break in the middle of that where I took up painting instead. And recently I've gone back to knitting. And so I've been knitting again for about a year, maybe a little bit less. And I've just basically started again where I had left off, and that was I have always enjoyed knitting vintage patterns. So when I'm saying vintage, anything between 1930s through to 1980s are the patterns that I enjoy. And I've knit a reasonable number of vintage patterns in the past. They do take a little bit longer to knit because they tended to use finer yarn, smaller gauge, so it's more work to create one garment. But I just really love the finished objects, and I find them flattering in terms of fit. I like the fact that they're generally very good quality because of that smaller, finer gauge. And you just can't buy garments in the shops that are as nice as a hand knitted vintage garment. You just can't find anything like it. So I'm going to share some progress with you in terms of what I've been working on. And yeah, it'd be great to have some conversations. Are you into vintage knitting as well? Are you into knitting more modern patterns, or do you go between the two of them, or are you into crochet or some other thing? I'm really keen to hear from you. Alright, so the first thing I'd like to show you is I've got a finished object. I'm wearing it now, and this one, it's originally from a book. This book was supposed to have original patterns in it that had also been sized up to some other sizes. I thought that I was knitting the original size, but after I started the project, I think I was not. The book that I knit this from is called Retro Knits, and I'm not sure when this was published. It's a bit of an older one. The particular pattern that I was knitting is this lady's pullover. Hopefully you can see that there. If I cover my face, it should focus. And what attracted me to this particular pattern was the fact, first of all, it's quite long. For a 1940s pattern, it was 1946. And normally 1940s patterns are kind of cropped at the waist because they had yarn shortages, and they received coupons that they could spend on yarn, so they had to reuse yarn during war times. But this particular one's quite long, and it has, so the fact that it's a ribbed design means that it's quite figure hugging, which is really nice when you want to wear something that's more like a t-shirt. And it's got these lovely kind of cable, they're actually kind of false cables, but there's lovely cable designs around the yoke. Now this cable design goes all the way around and it alternates, so every rib it has either the cable at the top or at the bottom. So when I started this pattern, it said to get gauge on 2.75mm needles, which I did using two strands of Colour Mart. I've taken my notes as the name of the yarn and I put it somewhere. So this is Colour Mart lamb's wool. It's soft lamb's wool. It's a heavy lace weight, and what I'll do is I'll share in the show notes the exact yarn it is, because the naming is a little bit confusing. But yes, so I used two strands of this, which made it go from a lace weight to a 4-ply, and tagging along with that, I had some leftover. Now these are all cone yarns. They're actually designed to be used with a machine, so they actually have some yarn oil on them, but I like to use coned yarns because typically you can get a little bit thinner than you can get from the shops, and when you're knitting vintage patterns, thinner yarn is better. Also, I find that when it's been put on a cone, the prices can be quite reasonable. You can get quite good quality yarns. So this one is a cashmere silk blend. I believe it's 65% cashmere, 35% silk, but again, I'll put that in the show notes. And this is a cobweb weight. So the reason I added one strand of this to one strand of my wool was I just wanted it to have a little bit more drape than just wool alone, and I also wanted to reduce the itchiness a little bit. And what that looked like, I'm kind of down to the end of it now since I finished the garment, but kind of looked like this marled yarn, which I actually ended up overdoing the project later, which I'll tell you a bit more about. But yeah, so I got gauged with these yarns, and I needed to have about, I believe it was 30 stitches per 4 inches, and on the 2.75s. So I achieved that, started the project, picked one. I was originally going to go with the second size in the book, and then when I saw how many stitches you had to cast on, I felt really dubious about that, because I had just finished another garment that had much fewer stitches on it than this one did. But because this starts a bit lower, it does have to go around the hips. So I ended up knitting, I decided to go down to the smaller size because I just wasn't entirely comfortable with how this was working out in terms of the number of stitches on the needle. Now I'm glad that I did, because as it turned out, the size that I was starting to knit, well, in fact, I think the entire book has some problems, because even though it tells you to get gauge on the 2.75mm needles, you only knit in 2.75mm needles around this middle here where it cinches in. The rest of the garment is actually knit on 3.25mm needles. And the really weird thing about it is they do provide schematics. So there's a page here that has the schematics on it, which is really unusual for a vintage garment. However, because this book reproduced the vintage one, they obviously decided to put some schematics in there. But all the sizes on the schematics were all based on the gauge from the 2.75mm needles, but the garment is knit with a 3.25. So somehow this just went completely wrong. I guess they didn't get anyone to test it, and the garment was going to be way too big. It just was not going to work out. So what I realized this as after I'd knit a few inches, I realized this is just too big. Luckily that was around the hips, but the bottom is definitely bigger than I would normally like it to be. And then I figured out that they had got the schematics wrong. And what I ended up having to do, originally it's a 6x6 rib, and what I ended up having to do was change it from a 6x6 to a 6x5. And when I did that, it reduced the number of stitches down, and that meant that the gauge that I had with the 3.25mm needles was going to work with the new stitch count. So yeah, so I had to make that alteration. I ended up, other than the very bottom, which is wider, I've used 6x5 at the top and on the sleeves as an intentional decision from that point forward. Now the other problem that I had was, so I got past all of that. I'm like, right, it's all fine now that I'm doing 6x5 ribbing, that it was fitting. But when I reached up to the underarms and started looking at the number of ribs on the top half, I wish that I had plotted this out on a spreadsheet or like in a graph before starting, because I would have discovered another mistake in the pattern, and that was the pattern needs to have an odd number of ribs in order to have the alternating cables. But for some reason mine ended up, and I've double checked the pattern, it is the case, 2 sizes out of 3 have this flaw, and that is that you end up with an even number of cables instead of an odd number. So the pattern designer should have shifted it along by half a cable in order to center the middle cable, but they didn't. It ends up with even. And the problem if you have even is then when you have one at the top, one at the bottom, one at the top, one at the bottom. If you have an even number of them, you'll end up with the whole pattern will be off center, but also you'll have one at the bottom on one arm and one at the top on the other arm. And then when you add the arms on, it'll look strange because you'll have 2 cables next to each other on one side and then 2 cables on not next to each other on the other side, and it will just look really horrible. So in order to fix that, I had to change the design to have 2 cables together at the top, then down and then up and then down, which means that I've got 2 next to each other on between the arm and the body on both sides, and then 2 next to each other on the top, and then an alternation in between, which isn't ideal, but it's better than the alternative. I did find that really disappointing, so I just don't recommend this pattern. Something definitely though that is a good idea to do in any vintage knitting pattern is to plan it a bit more in advance, because you can definitely run into gotchas, and if you've already spent months knitting on something, pulling all that out, it's disappointing because of the just sheer amount of work involved. Right, then the last thing that I needed to sort out was, I showed you before how mild the yarn was when I included the cobweb cashmere silk with the wool, and you couldn't actually see these, you probably can't see it anyway because of how dark the garment is, but you couldn't see these cables at all. They were entirely obscured by the marl, and I had always intended to overdye it anyway. I hadn't overdyed it in the yarn because I wanted to make sure that I didn't use any more of the yarn. I didn't want to dye any more of the yarn than I needed, because the cobweb weight, I wanted to keep it on the cone because otherwise it will get really, really tangled. So I decided I was going to dye the garment, and yeah, it wasn't looking, I mean, it was looking okay, but it wasn't really looking nice until I overdyed it, because the contrast between the light coloured yarn and the dark colour was just so much that it looked really extremely mild. And fortunately I managed to fix that up by overdyeing, and to make it even better, I was able to reuse the dye that's already in the wool, and that worked out really well because essentially now the colour is really consistent across the whole garment. And the way that I did that was I put the garment into an old slow cooker that I only use for yarn dyeing now, and I put in a whole bunch of washing powder, and washing powder raises the pH of the solution. And when it comes to dye, having a low pH, so acidic, fixes the dye into the yarn, and having a high pH, which is basic, can pull dye out of the yarn. So that's why when you use washing powder and you have like reds, for example, in the washing machine, it can come out and then leak dye all over all of your white things, because the soap powder is basic and it pulls that dye out of the yarn. So I soaked the garment in the slow cooker, turned it on, and let it sit in that for a bit with a whole bunch of washing machine powder, and exactly like I expected, it leaked a whole lot of the crimson dye from the garment into the water. I then took the garment out, rinsed it all off, and put a whole lot of vinegar into the water. And what vinegar does is it lowers the pH and sets it back into the garment. So I put the vinegar in, put the garment back into the slow cooker, turned it on, I made sure it was all stirred first. The fact that the garment was wet meant that it didn't strike straight away, so it didn't create any patchiness or anything. It came out perfect, and the crimson colour that was already in the dye reset back into the dye, and also set into the white parts from the other yarn. I did add a tiny bit of extra dye in a crimson colour just to be safe, just in case there wasn't enough dye that had leaked. But to be honest, I don't think I even needed to. I only added the tiniest bit, and there was still some dye in the water when it had finished cooking. Alright, so that's what happened with that. But I'm actually really happy with how this turned out, other than it being slightly bigger around the hips, but that's quite comfortable. And yeah, so it makes for a really comfortable garment. It's a little bit tight around the top, but this is a very 1940s style to have very tight fitting high necked garments, and so it's actually got a little opening at the back with a single button and a like a crochet loop to close buttons, so then it stays high around the neck. And one reason why they did that in the 1940s was war times, there was rations on clothing, so they needed to make their necklines higher so that they wouldn't get cold, because they didn't necessarily have a lot of scarves and things like that. Alrighty, so that was that particular garment. I'm also working on another, I've got a work in progress, and that is called Net Stitch and Ribbing. This one here. This one is from the 1930s, from 1933 Table Talk magazine, and I've got a little section on this, a little section problem solving this one. This garment has come out a bit too long, and it's entirely my fault. I lengthened it without reading the pattern. So this is the second time I have, I guess, knit from the pattern or done my interpretation without planning it out too well. And I thought that I was doing the right thing when I lengthened it, but it turned out I didn't. So yeah, I've ended up with too long a garment. But this particular one, it has alternating stripes, followed by this section here, which is intended to be done with intarsia, although I seamed mine. The reason being I misjudged the number, and I ended up changing over on a pearl, and I found out that you can't do intarsia on a pearl. You need to do it on a knit stitch next to a knit stitch. Otherwise, when the yarns wind around each other at the back, they can show at the front. So I changed mine to be seamed at the back because that wasn't looking very nice. And then it's essentially mesh all the way to the shoulders, and it's a saddle shoulder, so it doesn't go all the way to the very top because there's going to be a saddle here in between. Alright, so I have finished that one's the front. I finished a front and a back. This one's still got a hole in it because I haven't seamed it yet. And I have started on the sleeves. It's a bit tangled. Started on the sleeves two at a time. Alrighty, now what can I tell you about this? So the yarn that I'm using for this is Bendigo Woolen Mills 4-ply, and it's Luxury, which is 100% superwash merino. I left the black yarn as is. It's very soft, so I've got a feeling this one's going to peel. I can already see that it's like fuzzy and peeling just in the ball, so this one's going to peel. When it comes to the grey, I dyed it myself using this particular shade of grey. I actually really like this grey, it's lovely. It's, in real life it comes out slightly purple. I don't know if you can tell that on the screen, but it's got purple undertones, and it's the Pearl Grey by Rit dye. So I didn't mix it with anything else. I just used the plain pearl dye out of the container. So if you wanted to get the same shade of grey, you can also get it using the Pearl Grey Rit dye. And I used my slow cooker for this as well. You can see that it's pretty even, but it does have a very slight amount of tonal variegation in there, which is the way I like it. I don't like insane variegation but I don't like just really flat commercial yarn, so this is perfect for me. Alright, so I think that's going to be finished soon. I've just got the sleeves to do and I think they'll knit up quick. Alright, so this is the situation I'm running into. Basically, I don't know if you can see this. Basically, when I started knitting this, it was going to be for a 32-inch bust. And I have a 39-inch bust, so obviously I had to make it a bit wider. So I calculated that a 39-inch bust was about 25% larger than the 32-inch. I think it's about 22%, something like that. And so I figured, well, most likely someone with a 32-inch bust is also going to be a lot shorter than me. So I figured, well, I'll just increase the height as well. And I decided I would increase the height by 25%. Really, what I should have done though was actually look at the pattern more closely and figure out how many inches it was from armpit to the bottom, because instead what I ended up doing was just increasing all of these different stripes by 25% to make it proportional. And when I got up to about this point, I realised this is now a really tall garment. Alright, we have cats. Hang on. So this is now a really long garment. And when I measure it against myself, I don't know if you can see because of the camera, but when I measure it up against myself, no, you can't see that, yeah, it's really quite long. It comes right down to definitely a bit below my hip. Now, I decided to go with it. I was considering frogging it, but I decided to go with it. But the problem I've run into now is I've done the front and the back, and once I got up to this point here, I decided to just go with the height that was in the pattern because I realised this was too tall. So in actual fact, the top fits me quite well. If I go underarm to shoulder, this is actually going to have a saddle shoulder, so it doesn't go all the way to the top. This fits me quite well. But the amount of grey yarn I have left is this much. And I've measured this out, and it's 25% of the 200 gram skein that I started with, but sleeves are typically about a third of the garment. I've done the front and the back, so I should have about a third of the amount of yarn left. I've got all this black, so I've got heaps of black, but the grey I don't have much of left, and because I hand dyed it, there's not really much chance of me getting exactly the same colour again. The good news is I did just use a root dye rather than mixing my own. So in theory, if I was absolutely desperate, I could try to get the colour exactly the same, and it would probably, I'd probably better get, I've got cats running around me. I could probably get a fairly close match, but it's just that I might not get the saturation quite right. It might end up being a bit lighter or a bit darker. So if that happened, then I'd have to obviously mix a couple of bowls together to like alternate as it went up the shoulder. Anyway, I didn't really want to have a situation where I ran out of yarn right at the shoulder. And the other thing that I thought of as well is because, so the reason why it's potentially a problem is the sleeve stripes are supposed to exactly match the stripes that are in here. And if I was to have the stripes exactly the same height as what I did with that 25% extra length, what I realised is my arm's going to be too long as well. So I've checked the gauge on this. I've checked the gauge on the ribbing section and on the mesh section. And when I did the maths, based on the amount of stitches that were going to be in the pattern, it's come to 25 inches. Now, I don't know about you, but this is pretty long for arms. So if I measure 25 inches from my armpit, it actually goes down to, I don't know, kind of like the joint in my thumb, but it's not going to be right up in my armpit anyway. So if I look at that, it's going to be like right to the end of my thumb. And that's not where I want my sleeve to finish. I want it to finish around 20. So I need to cut 5 inches out of the sleeve length, and that should hopefully fix my yarn issue if I cut it out of a grey section. I don't know that I've got 5 inches in the grey though. Let me just quickly check. Yeah, it doesn't really work because this grey section's 4 inches. And yes, if I take out of these ones, then it'll look weird. It'll look more black than grey, and proportionally the stripes won't be the same on the sleeve as they were on the garment. So I think it would have really been so much better if I hadn't knit it too long in the first place, because it would have saved me time. I wouldn't have had to worry about having this mutantly large garment, and it would have saved me yarn. And now, yeah, basically my arm's gonna be too long. So what I think I'm gonna have to do is on the arm, go back to the 25% less height for all of these stripes. Essentially, I've got about just over 12 inches to this section here where I stopped doing the larger stripes. And if I measure this, actually, it's about 11 inches to the shoulder. So rather than 25, I've actually got 23. I must have just miscalculated the gauge based on the maths before. So I've got 23 here, which means that if I subtract 3 inches from this 12 to get me to 9, then I'll have the 20-inch sleeve. And that is actually exactly what it would have been had I not altered the pattern in the first place. So really I just need to go with the original pattern and I should be fine. I should be exactly with the right sleeve length. Now, I've got a couple of other works in progress as well, but these ones haven't really seen much love lately. I've got the Winter Forest Tam. Hold that up. This is the Winter Forest Tam, and it's a free pattern. I looked at it before I started the video. I think it's called Ruskin's Notes was the pattern name. So the person that came up with the pattern. And for this I'm using a Rowan 4-ply Superwash Merino. I can't remember the actual name of the yarn, sorry, I'll have to link it later, but it's been discontinued. I've still got a whole bunch of balls of it because I had intended to knit a Fair Isle jumper for myself, and I decided not to in the end because I was concerned that the superwash wool wouldn't stick very well. So now I've got like a whole jumper's worth. And actually I've got more than that because I bought several balls of every colour. And because that yarn was really old, it got attacked by moths. I didn't have it in a plastic bag, it got attacked by moths and I had to break it. So now I've got it all these tiny balls. I've just got millions of them. So I'm planning to make plenty of hats using that yarn. I've got one more work in progress, and this has been on the needles for a really long time actually. This one's probably been on the needles for maybe 9 months. It's the Ingrid Sweater by Petite Knits, and I'm knitting this with 2 4-ply yarns held together. The yarn was by Manos and Sons, which is an Australian yarn company, and it's a alpaca, and I believe this one's discontinued as well, because I tried to look it up again to find out the name of it, and I couldn't find it anywhere. So I dyed this one myself. The original one was a kind of a taupe colour. I dyed it denim, but I'm not really happy with the dye job I did on this one. I kind of feel like it's a little bit too variegated in the middle. I would have liked this to be a bit more subtle. I didn't dye it using my slow cooker. I dyed it on the stovetop, and as a result, where it was at the bottom, it went a bit darker compared to at the top, and yeah, it's created this really variegated effect. So most likely when this garment's finished, I'm going to over dye it again as the whole garment to just to even out that kind of patchiness that's come about from that dye job. Yeah, and look, to be honest, this one's probably going to sit around a little while. It's not vintage, so I don't love it as much as all the vintage things. It's one that I cast on when I first started knitting again after a break, and I just wanted something simple to work on. So that's that. Alrighty. Now, I've talked to death about my knitting, so I won't go too much into acquisitions, but I do have a few. I'll just go through them a little bit faster. Now, when we were my husband and I went on a honeymoon recently. We just got married in March, and on our honeymoon we went to Japan. We mainly were around the rural areas of Japan, but we spent a few days in Tokyo as well. And the whole time that I was in Japan, I was really hoping to see what Japanese yarn was like, but we just couldn't find a yarn store in the rural locations. There was one rural location where I found out there was a yarn store, and I was begging my husband to walk an hour with me to get to this yarn store, and because we didn't have a car. We ended up catching a bus. So he agreed to go to the yarn store, but only if we got public transport. So we got a bus there, found the yarn store. It turned out to be, I was expecting it to be quite a large one because it was a box store, basically a box craft store. But it turned out to be quite a small craft store, and they mainly had crochet cotton and things for making origami toys. Is that how you pronounce it? So that was a little bit disappointing. I didn't buy any yarn there. I didn't find anything that was nice for making garments. So then when we got to Tokyo, which was at the end of our trip, I said, right, we have to find a yarn store that actually sells yarn that I would want to knit with. And the one that was near our hotel was another kind of craft store. So it had a lot more range of yarn. It was about 50%, maybe 60% sewing, and then the rest was kind of a combination between knitting and crochet and then other needle crafts. So it had quite a mixture, and I found 2 lovely books and some yarn in this shop, and I was really happy with these books. I was really excited. So it's called Darning, Repair, Make, and I don't know what this one's called. I think it's also Darning, Repair, Make, but it's like the second one. And these particular books are about using darning to fix holes in your garments, and the examples in them are just beautiful. So, and they have these really good instructions. So even though I can't speak Japanese, it's quite clear what you need to do because they have these step-by-step instructions with pictures. And so all of the darning instructions are all pictorial like that. And just the examples in here are stunning. So they've got one here where they've used embroidery to cover a hole. This one here, they've embroidered under her underarm where she had a hole. They've got examples of darning knits. So here's a whole bunch of darning socks. And here's one where they've darned, she's darned inside a like fisherman's Gansey type sweater, and she's garned in a contrasting colour, which I find really interesting. So it's all about repairing your clothing, but repairing them in a way that makes it more beautiful than before. So yeah, I've got 2 of those books and I was so happy with those. From that same store, I also bought some yarn. So I noticed that in Japan, they mainly tend to knit with cotton and linen. And they do use wool, but that's, again, they have a lower grade wool that they use to make toys with. They don't really make garments from it. And I think it's because it's quite humid in Tokyo. So yeah, they tend to prefer summer type yarns. So this one, I got a bag of 10 25-gram balls. It's called Shiny Linen. And a lot of yarns in Japan, you couldn't get them in sizes larger than 25-gram balls. So I don't know why that is. It was just, I don't know, they just like having these cute little balls. I also got this one here. It's an off-white. I couldn't tell you what colourway these are, but this one's a cotton linen blend, and this one's in a chain construction. Yeah, this one's twisted ply, but this one's a chain knit. And yeah, I'm really looking forward to knitting these up. I've got 10 balls of each. And the funny thing was, when I saw them, they were actually on sale. So they had this discount, half price, and I looked at them, I quite liked them. So I decided to go with those. And then when I took them to the counter, the woman explained to me that you only get the sale if you're a member. And I said, well, I don't live in Japan, so I'm not likely to be a member. She said, that's okay, I can make you a member anyway. So for 5,000 yen, which is about the equivalent of $5 Australian dollars, I became a member at the yarn store. She gave me the half price discount, and then I'll probably never go in there again. But that was fun. I was really happy with that. So 10 balls of each of that. And then while we were in Tokyo, we also happened to be near another store which was called Walnut Tokyo. And this store had a completely different aesthetic. The first store I went into was more of your just like local craft store type thing, with the sewing and knitting and a whole bunch of other crafts all thrown in. Whereas the Walnut one was a specialist knitting and crochet store only, so it just had yarns in there. Actually, they did have a little bit of sewing stuff, but it was right at the back. And this particular store had mostly American yarns, so really common products like Knitting for Olive and Cascade 220, you could find all of those there. But I had a look on the actual Japanese rack, and I decided to buy this beautiful yarn. So I got this kind of olivey bottle green. The dog's running past, making a bit of noise. The brand is called Parade Festive Natural Blend. It's called Walnut Kyoto, so it's their own brand of yarn. But I was in the Tokyo store. It's a fingering weight, approximately 420 yards or 384 meters per 100 grams. And it's made up of wool, 60% cotton, 20% silk, 10% linen, 10%, and it's spun and dyed in Japan. So first I grabbed the 2 green ones because I just loved this shade of green. I really love autumnal colours, and it's just beautiful heathered dark green. And I was looking for a contrast colour to go with it. And I was umming and ahhing about different colours. I was almost going to go with this more autumnal orange colour. And then I saw this one, and it's so vibrant. I really love it. And it's got the same heathered effect, obviously it's the same base. But this one was hand dyed. Yeah, I don't know. Maybe they're both hand dyed, but this one specifically says hand dyed on it, and it was in the hand dyed section, and it was a bit more expensive. And the brand name is Amirisu. But anyway, it's the same base, And so I bought this one to be the contrast, and I just think they're so beautiful. I can't wait to knit with these. Alright, well that's the kind of the end of yarny related acquisitions, but in terms of vintage, I also picked up some vintage skirts over the last month, and I thought these were really fun and I wanted to share them with you as well. So I picked this one up in Japan. I went to a vintage clothing store in Japan and I found this, and it reminds me of the skirts that like Anna and Elsa wear in Frozen. Just find it really gorgeous. It's so it's quite a big like puffy skirt. It's got this like rip crack at the bottom and the flowers in there. It's just really lovely. So I think this would go really well with a like a Tyrolean style, like some kind of Scandinavian or European inspired clothing. So obviously Tyrolean is not Scandinavian, but it's all part of that same style as well. Like, you know, German or Austrian, if it was going to be Tyrolean. And I also picked up, this one I didn't pick up in Japan, I got it shipped to me just before I left, but I got this amazing wool kilt. I love kilts, they're my favourite type of skirt to wear. And so yeah, 100% wool, perfect condition, there's not a hole in it anyway. And just as a funny thing actually, I had bought myself 2 kilts before I went. I knew that someone was going to be home because my mum was going to be looking after the kids, and I thought that I had got 2 completely different kilts. But I also got this one, and then when it arrived I realised it was exactly the same tartan. So literally the same family tartan, but just the squares are a bit bigger. So if you can see this one, it's big squares. This is the same colour but small squares. So yeah, that ended up being quite funny. So essentially they're going to go with exactly the same outfits because they're the same shades of red and the same shades of green, but oh well, I'm starting a bit of a kilt collection. Okay, well I think that's everything for today. And again, I'm so pleased to be able to have this conversation with you. If you are interested in the same things, please reach out and say hi. Please subscribe. The more subscribers we have, the more Google will show everybody that this channel is available, and hopefully we'll find the right types of people who are looking for the same kind of content. And I hope you have a fantastic day. Alrighty, bye.